All right. So we're still early in our conversation about defining organisms or exploring life and properties that are used to identify or define living things. We're going to take a look today and kind of see the connection between the chemistry in life. And I know when I say chemistry, a lot of us, might tense up because we don't really like chemistry, but everything about us is actually chemical based. All right. So chapter 2 is appropriately entitled The Chemical Basis of Life. So we're going to take a brief look today at the connection between, chemical elements and atoms and matter, things around us, and life. So there are a number of chemical elements that are essential for life. And when I say chemical elements, I'm talking about those elements that you've seen on the periodic table, right? Periodic table of elements serves a very important purpose in our lives from a biological standpoint. By the definition of biology is the study of life. And so life wouldn't exist without these, some of these building blocks that we're going to take a look at. And these are pure elements that we can find on the periodic table. So we're going to see the connection between that. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here. Did I press record? I did. So I am recording this and you will be able to go back and review it later. Let me pull this up. I'm going to say we're in chapter 2. Okay. So we're taking a look today at the chemical basis of life. All right. Can you guys see my slides? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So the introduction, which is what I just kind of started to mention, is that knowledge of chemistry is in fact essential for understanding organisms and how they function. Okay. So these chemical similarities that have been noted and identified throughout the years, there are chemical similarities amongst all organisms that sort of provide evidence for this concept of evolution. All right, we talked about that a little bit on last class, the evolution, and there's the notion that we all derived from a single, common organism, right? And so for the purpose of this class, we'll take that a step further and say that we've identified similarities, chemical similarities across all organisms that sort of supports this notion that we all derive from a common ancestor. So anyway, we're going to take a look today at some big ideas. Write these 3 big ideas down. We're looking at elements, atoms, and compounds. I know you've heard these terms before. Today, we're going to make that connection, and you should, by the end of today, be able to distinguish between what is an atom, what is an element, and what is a compound. All right. And it is these compounds that we, collectively rely on for our functions. Okay, and beings. Okay, these elements interact together to form compounds. If I said water, right, we recognize that water is a compound. This is a molecule that's made from 2 elements. What 2 elements make up water? What pure elements together make up water? Somebody tell me. What's the formula for water?
H2O.
So what elements are those? That's exactly what it is.
I didn't want to say it because I didn't know if I sounded slow or not. So I was just like, I don't know.
No, absolutely. You know this. This is basic information that I'm just kind of pulling to you in a different context. So you've all heard of H2O. H2O is the chemical formula for water. That means that those elements, hydrogen and oxygen, those are very pure elements on the periodic table. Pure substances interact together. 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom makes a molecule of water. Okay. So anyway, that's why we're saying that knowledge of chemistry is essential for understanding organisms and how we function. So we're going to take a look at that today. Are my slides advancing?
Yes.
Okay. Big ideas, elements, atoms, and compounds. Living organisms are made of atoms of certain elements that are mostly going to combine together into compounds. So we're going to take a look at that today. These elements interact together to form molecules that we call compounds. All right. Chemical bonds. All right. These are the structure of these atoms okay, determine how they interact with atoms of other elements to get these new molecules or compounds being made. So we're going to take a look at this concept of chemical bond formation and the attraction between, you know, atoms of other elements in order for compounds to be made. And then we're going to talk a little bit about water. Water is a major requirement for life. We know that our bodies are mostly made up of water. All right, so we're going to take a look at some of the unique properties of water and why we refer to it as the universal solvent. Okay, and a solvent is something that can dissolve a substance, right? And so, you know, you can just think from your everyday life when you're cooking or whatever, you know, you're mixing and making things, mixtures, dissolving substances. You typically use water for a lot of your bases. So water is referred to as universal solvent. So those are some of the big ideas that I want you to jot down today. So the things that I want you to be able to do by the end of this lecture is identify the name and function of the major chemical elements in living things. There are 4 that you're going to be listening for. These 4 chemical elements are going to be found in every living thing. So you need to know what the 4 elements are and what their functions are, like what roles do they play in living things. And we already talked about 2 of them, hydrogen and oxygen. So you're going to be listening for 4 more. All right, then we want to distinguish between atoms and elements. All right, again, if you look at that periodic table, you're going to be looking at the pure substance in the form of an element, right? But then there are some smaller particles that make up these elements, and those are called atoms. And then we'll look also at subatomic particles. And then lastly, when it comes to, again, just kind of utilizing the information that's on the periodic table, we want you to be able to distinguish between the atomic number and the atomic mass of an element, okay? Because they do tell us some important things about these elements that sort of contributes to the properties of them being able to bond and interact with atoms of other elements, all right? So let's start our conversation today. We're talking about chemicals, atoms, elements. I have a question. What is matter? Okay, what is matter? What is matter? What's the general definition of matter? Anyone? You've learned this before. All right.
Any
Go ahead.
any substance that has mass.
Yeah, so matter is anything that has mass and takes up space, right? So everything around us is considered to be matter, right? What is matter? Anything that has mass and occupies space. So this can be anything in the form of a solid, a liquid, or a gas, right? These are the different states in which matter can exist, all right? Matter is sort of the building block of elements, right? We're composed of matter, okay? And so our overall point we're making here is that organisms are composed of elements, which these elements usually interact together to form compounds, all right? But if we step that back just a little bit, we're looking at basically combinations of matter. Matter is composed of chemical elements, okay? Of all of the chemical elements that are on the periodic table, I think there are about 118 elements on the periodic table. About 92 of those appear naturally in nature, exist naturally. Some of them are synthetically formed. But of those, all those elements you've seen on the periodic table before, only about 25 of those are what we would consider essential for human life, okay? And so those 25 are collectively essential, you know, across the board in various amounts. But 4, okay, 4 of those 25 make up majority of our mass, our weight. Like our bodies are composed of mainly these 4 elements that we're going to talk about today. And you, again, want to be intimately familiar with these 4 elements because as your bullet indicates here, and you need to jot this down in your notes, that 4 elements make up about 96% of the weight of most living organisms. Okay. And so these four elements typically interact together to form various compounds. And so by definition, we're going to define our compound as a substance consisting of two or more elements in a fixed ratio. Okay. And so these compounds are formed, right, when elements interact together in a fixed ratio. So this isn't something that's happening randomly, right? A molecule of water is always going to contain 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Okay, that is a fixed ratio of elements of 2 to 1. That doesn't change in a molecule of water. Okay, so you should be able to have a general consensus. If I use the term compound, you're automatically thinking, okay, there's more than one element involved here. Okay, what elements make up this compound? Okay, and so matter, there's different types of matter, right? Rocks, air, you guys are students, we're all matter. We have mass and we take up space. Okay, all are composed of chemical elements. All right, we're made up of various chemical elements, and we're going to take a look today at the combination of chemical elements that are required for life. So anyway, I'm going to walk it back just another moment and define a chemical element. All right, I'm using this term, but I want to make sure we have a clear definition of what is a chemical element. All right, down here in my right, I have a quick little snap of what some elements on our periodic table looks like. All right, you've heard of calcium before, you've heard of neon. Okay, the working definition that we're going to have is that a chemical element is the simplest form of a substance that cannot be broken down any further. Okay, each element is represented by a chemical symbol. All right, so this abbreviation right here, Ca, is referred to as the chemical symbol for calcium. Okay, each element is represented by a chemical symbol. That chemical symbol will be anywhere from 1 to 2 letters. Okay, and in most cases, the letters are the first and second letter of the spelling of the name of the element, but that's not always the case. And so some elements on the periodic table have a chemical symbol, excuse me, that is not indicative of how you spell that element. Can you think of any?
Gold.
Gold is AU, right?
Mm-hmm.
And silver, was it AG?
Sodium.
Sodium, Na, absolutely. What are some others? Iron, I think, is Fe maybe. Yeah, so anyway, these chemical symbols are important. Over time, you know, the more that you interact with these chemicals or elements, you'll start to learn that what their chemical symbols are. I will say briefly, though, that I don't expect you to sort of memorize and learn the periodic table. Whatever exercises we do or whatever questions that I ask you about the periodic table, I'll give it to you in terms of the periodic table itself, but it'll, you know, you will be required to know how to use it, okay, depending on what I'm asking you. But I would give you a copy of the periodic table itself. All right, so yes, okay, so about 119 chemical elements on the periodic table, 92 of those occur naturally in nature. You're making a big asterisk by the fact that only about 4 of those elements are required for sustaining or making up living things, okay? The 4 most abundant elements in living things include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Write those down. The acronym CHON is how you should all remember it. I mean, you can organize it how you want, but I always remember CHON. When I'm thinking about the abundant elements in living things, I'm always thinking CHON: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Okay, 1 second here. All right. So the four most abundant elements in living things include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay. These can be found very easily on the periodic table. So elements in abundance in humans. Carbon, we know that carbon forms the backbone of all organic molecules. So if we looked at the chemical formula for any organic substance, we're going to find that it is made from carbon. That is something that you should note and remember. All living things, all organic substances are going to contain carbon. All right. Hydrogen, all right, this is mostly going to be found in water. You know that water is a very important substance in living things for a number of different purposes. Helps in our bodies, it helps to transport nutrients, remove waste, lubricate our organs, regulate body temperature. You know, there's so many factors or responses, if you will, to the changes of water in our bodies. You know that we're made mostly of water. Over about 70% of our weight or mass is water. Oxygen, okay, make a note. Oxygen is the most abundant element in humans, and this substance is required for cellular respiration. And we're going to talk about cellular respiration in another chapter, but it's essentially a metabolic process for how our bodies break down the foods that we eat for energy. Okay. And we require oxygen for that to take place. All right, so it's not just breathing. I know when we see respiration, we start to think about breathing, but cellular respiration is a totally different process. It's a process that animals use to get energy from the foods that we eat. Okay. Nitrogen, okay, nitrogen is required for protein production. Okay, it's a component of our proteins. Now proteins are the functional units of our cells, right? And so without proteins we wouldn't be able to exist. All right, all of our cells are responding to a protein expression profile in order to function. You know, we have thousands and thousands of different cell types in our bodies, and those different cell types get their jobs or information from the proteins that are expressed at any given time. And so nitrogen is a very important chemical element for living things. Okay, there's not an exchange of nitrogen gas in the lungs. And so I mentioned earlier that 24, 25-ish chemical elements are considered to be essential, right? Now, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are the ones that are found in great abundance. They're going to make up about 97% of the mass of living things. But there are others that, while they're not found in great abundance, they still are necessary. All right. And we refer to those as trace elements. Define this term trace elements in your notes. We're talking about those elements that are required in very small, very minute amounts in plants and animals. They're still required, although they're only required in very minute amounts. That's what trace elements are. So we have elements that are in great abundance. We know what those are. And then we have those that are going to only be required in small amounts. And we call those trace elements. Okay. Examples of trace elements that plants and animals require as essential minerals are iodine, manganese, copper. Okay. There are a few more that you'll come across as you read through literature in terms of the chemical basis of life. All right. Trace elements are common additives to food and water that we consume on a day-to-day basis. Some we use to prevent disease. For example, fluoride. I know most of us might be familiar with the fact that fluoride is added to municipal water systems, okay, in order to, into other, you know, dental products that you can buy over the counter to help reduce tooth decay or prevent cavities from being formed, right? So our water systems are fortified with fluoride, all right? Several chemicals are added to foods for various reasons, for to help preserve it, you know, to make it more nutritious, to make it look better. It just depends on what the purpose is, but we certainly, you know, utilize properties of these chemical elements in our day-to-day lives. All right, and so trace elements do have their important role in our lives, although they are not in abundance. Okay. This is just a visual. I'm a very visual person, but I'm saying to you that living organisms are made up of atoms of certain elements. We talked about those 4 elements, Chan, all right, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. This schematic here just shows you sort of a percentage wise of how much of each element is in our bodies. All right, this red is representing oxygen. I mentioned earlier that oxygen is the most abundant element in our bodies, right? This dark gray, okay, this is again just a proportion. It's not necessarily to scale. It's just for those of us that are visual. This dark gray represents carbon. Okay, carbon is a very significant chemical element in living things. Light gray, hydrogen. Okay, and this dark blue is nitrogen. Okay, a major constituent of proteins. All right. If we looked at I will get to a chapter where we talk a little bit more about amino acids and so forth. We'll see how those nitrogens play as side chains in those amino acids. And amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. All right, and so that's me highlighting that there is a chemical basis of life. Everything about us has a chemical origin, if you will. These chemical elements interact together to form compounds, and we'll see a little bit later the compounds that our bodies require to sustain itself in the form of those macromolecules. Okay, we'll talk about the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and so forth. I think it's actually in our next chapter. But let's continue to talk about elements and atoms and compounds. Okay, do we have any questions before I keep moving? Okay, feel free to stop me if you have any questions. All right, chemical elements, atoms, and compounds. All right, so we're making connections between relationships right now. So we've got compounds, we've got elements, and then we've got atoms. Okay, atoms are going to be sort of the building blocks of an element. Okay, elements contain atoms. So we'll define an atom as the smallest portion of an element that retains its chemical properties. All right, so think about taking any element and you're breaking it down into its smallest form, right? And we end up with an atom. That atom is going to be the smallest portion of that element that's still going to retain the chemical properties of that element, right? And we know that various chemical elements have different properties, okay, reactivities and so forth. And so an atom is going to be the smallest piece of that puzzle that still retains whatever those chemical properties are of that element. And so atoms are made up of tiny pieces of matter that we call subatomic particles, okay? These subatomic particles make up an atom. So if I ask for you to describe to me the makeup or composition of an atom, you're going to tell me that it is made up of subatomic particles. And this name here, subatomic, lets you know that we're talking about the small pieces of matter that makes up an atom. So now we have subatomic particles, atoms, elements, and then compounds. So let's look at the 3 subatomic particles. You probably learned about them before. There are 3 subatomic particles in every atom: protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay, if we look over here at this diagram, we have the diagram, a simple diagram showing the structure of an atom. Okay, this major circle right here represents our atom, and inside of the atom we have a structure known as the nucleus. Okay, the nucleus houses 2 types of subatomic particles. Okay, protons and neutrons are going to be found in the nucleus of an atom. Write that down. If you're asked to describe the structure of an atom, you know, you're going to draw your little circle that sort of represents the atom itself, and then in the middle you're going to have that nucleus, right? And inside of our nucleus we have protons and neutrons, right? And then outside of the nucleus we have various energy shells, these valence, or we'll say energy shells that surrounds our nucleus, and that is where you will find your electrons. Okay, so right now we're saying that there are three types of subatomic particles that make up atoms. Okay, those subatomic particles by name are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay, in terms of location in the atom where you can find these pieces of matter, inside the nucleus, we're going to find our protons and neutrons, and then out in our outer energy shells is where we will find our electrons. All right. And it is these electrons in these outer energy shells that are responsible for interaction between atoms of different elements in order to form compounds. All right. This is just another visual of a subatomic part of an atom where we can actually see the distribution of subatomic particles. Over here we have, this is our atom right here, right? Inside we have a nucleus, all right? Inside the nucleus, we're gonna have our protons and neutrons. And then in these outer energy shells, we'll have our electrons, right? And so these subatomic particles do have a charge, all right? You do need to be able to identify or connect the charge with the actual atom, so, particle, all right? These subatomic particles. So protons are positively charged, write that down. Neutrons are neutral or uncharged, right? And then electrons are negatively charged, right? So if I was writing something to tell you about the subatomic particles of any given atom, I would indicate, you know, these protons with the P, you know, a positive sign, a plus sign by it. Protons are positively charged and electrons are negatively charged. All right. What questions do we have? Any questions? Okay. All right, so another illustration here of the structure of an atom. You may be asked to draw this one day. All right, so again, we're drawing our circle here to represent our atom. And inside of it, you know, we're going to show the nucleus being present. And depending on the actual element, okay, the distribution of these subatomic particles would correspond to the actual element itself. All right. The number of protons and neutrons are going to correspond to the subatomic. The number of protons will the number of protons in the nucleus of the atom will correspond with the atomic number on the periodic table. All right, and we'll get to that in just a second. And so if you were asked to draw the structure of an atom for a particular element, you would make sure that your number of protons, neutrons, and electrons correspond to the actual element. Okay. And so, great. That brings me to my next point, the atomic number, right? So you've seen the periodic table before where we have our chemical symbol in the middle. We talked about that, right? The chemical symbol is just the 1 or 2 letter abbreviation of the name of the element. And then above that, in most cases, we're going to find a whole number, right? A whole number. This whole number represents the atomic number, right? The atomic number is a number that is unique to every element, okay? And it represents the number of protons in the nucleus of the atom, right? And so what we're saying is that every atom of an element has a fixed number of protons in the nucleus. The number of protons doesn't change, right? And so those number of protons in the nucleus is known as the atomic number. All right. And so we therefore use the atomic number to identify an atom, okay, or an element. So if I gave you a question and I told you to identify the chemical element that had 6 protons in its nucleus, your job is to know that the number of protons corresponds to the atomic number. Okay, so your job would be to look at the periodic table and figure out which element, okay, has an atomic number of 6. This atomic number is unique to each element. There aren't going to be any with the same atomic number. Okay, and so the atomic number determines an atom's identity and it defines the element. All right, tells us the number of protons in the nucleus. All right, and this atomic number, again, just for point of clarity, because there's another number here that you see, the atomic mass, and we'll get to that in a second. The atomic number is always going to be a whole number. Okay, and because also depending on the periodic table that you're looking at, it could be arranged a little bit differently. Like typically the chemical symbol is still going to be in the middle, but maybe the atomic number is somewhere else in terms of location. It could be high, it could be low, it could be to the left, to the right. But one thing that doesn't change is that it's going to be a whole number, right? Whereas this atomic mass, as you can see, can be represented as a decimal, with a decimal. All right. So if you didn't know anything else and you forgot everything that I just said, and if I just showed you an image here of this element off the periodic table and I asked for you to tell me the atomic number of this element, the first thing you're going to look for is the number that doesn't have a decimal with it. Okay, it's a whole number. All right. So that's the atomic number. So we're here. Let's make sure we're not all, let's make sure we're all together. We're looking at atoms, the structure of an atom, right? And we said atoms are made up of 3 subatomic particles, right? 3 subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons, right? Protons and neutrons are going to be found inside the nucleus of an atom, right? And then our electrons are going to be out in that outer energy shell. So we said that the atomic number tells us the number of protons that are found in an atom. Atomic number corresponds to the number of protons in the atom, right? At this point, I have a checkpoint question that I'll let you, work through on your own as you're reviewing later, because we want to keep going, all right? But you should be able to compare and contrast chemical elements and atoms. And so when I say compare and contrast, I want you to tell me how these things are alike or different. What's the relationship between these two? All right, in this case, you should definitely understand that chemical elements are made up of atoms, right? That's the relationship between those two. All right, the other piece of information that's important on the periodic table is the atomic mass of an element. Okay, so remember we talked about the distribution of those subatomic particles. We got protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and we have electrons out in those outer energy shells. All right, so the atomic mass then is going to be determined by adding together the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus of the atom. Right, so you will have to do a little basic math if I asked you some questions. All right, I expect you to be able to manipulate an equation if you needed to for, calculating it would be basic arithmetic if anything. But the atomic mass, as the name suggests, is the mass of an atom. Okay, the mass, right? Some people use mass and weight interchangeably, but the mass of an atom indicates how much matter this atom contains. Okay, so it's kind of like its weight, like how much matter does this atom contain? All right, that number or mass is going to be indicated in atomic mass units. Okay. And so the atomic mass is the other number that you would find on the periodic table, and it will often contain a decimal. Okay, so you should be able to distinguish between the information or the use of the atomic number versus the atomic mass. The atomic number is the number of protons, whereas the atomic mass, right, which indicates the mass of the element, is determined by the number of protons plus neutrons in our nucleus of that atom. Okay. And so some more checkpoint questions here. Which subatomic particles determine the atomic number? Someone tell me real quick. What subatomic particles determine the atomic number?
Protons.
Protons. And which subatomic particles determine the atomic mass?
It's the average number of protons and neutrons.
Yeah, it's not the average, it's the sum. You add them together. Protons plus neutrons equals atomic mass.
What about isotopes of element?
Okay. In the sense of, if we're not considering isotopes or any variations, it's the protons plus neutrons. Okay. Valence electrons, real quick. So let's shift for a moment and look at now. So we're clear on, you know, basic properties of elements that are required for living things. We're clear that atoms of different elements interact together, right, to form compounds, and that happens by way of a chemical reaction, right? Chemical behavior of an atom is determined. Remember, I mentioned those electrons in those outer energy shells, right? Those valence electrons are going to indicate or dictate how atoms of different elements interact together, right? If you can recall the periodic table, maybe the last time you took chemistry was in high school, but there are rows and then there are columns, all right? Elements that share the same chemical properties or behavior are going to be designated in the same vertical columns. Okay, they're going to have the same tendencies to gain, lose, or share electrons as they interact with atoms of different elements. And again, this isn't chemistry class, so I really don't expect you to I'm not going to expect you to know all of the ins and outs about this, but you do need to be able to make kind of these basic connections between atoms and elements, and understanding how they play a role in living things. All right, so the chemical reactions, the point I'm getting ready to make about chemical reactions is that you should understand and be able to read and understand what's happening in a chemical reaction. All right, it's representing what's a chemical equation represents what's happening in a chemical reaction. The point that I want you to make here, as we're talking about atoms, elements, and compounds, is that atoms of different elements interact together to form compounds, right? And it is these compounds that we're concerned about in terms of form and function or physiology of living things, right? A chemical compound is created when atoms of two or more different elements combine in that fixed ratio that I mentioned earlier, and I used water as an example. Water is a chemical compound that's composed of hydrogen and oxygen in a fixed ratio of 2 to 1. Okay, and so all chemical compounds that are formed are going to have this same setup of the interactions between atoms of these various elements in a fixed ratio. Okay. This is an example of a compound that's formed between sodium and chlorine. And we definitely want to stop to appreciate that separately, sodium has its own set of properties. Chlorine has its own set of properties. When we mix these two elements together, we get a completely different molecule or compound being made with completely different properties. Okay. And so I mentioned chemical reactions, so we can represent what's happening in a chemical reaction with the chemical equation. All right. This is a biology class, so for the purpose of this class, again, we do see chemical equations. So the point I want you to be able to understand here is that chemical equations represent what's going on in a chemical reaction. Okay, there are two components in this chemical reaction. We have the reactants. Okay, these are the key players. These are what's actually participating in the chemical reaction. And then we have the products, right? Products are the substances that are being formed as a result of the chemical reactions, right? So you should be able to describe or sort of have a basic understanding of what's happening in a chemical reaction, right? And we know that a chemical equation represents what's happening. And so one of the properties that we talked about for living things was trying to maintain homeostasis. We talked about metabolism. The metabolism, by definition, is sort of the total sum of all of the chemical reactions that's taking place in our bodies, right? So our bodies are undergoing chemical reactions constantly, right? And so these chemical reactions can be represented with an equation. What chemical reaction is being represented by this image that I have here? Does anyone know?
Photosynthesis.
This is photosynthesis, all right? Photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that's absolutely required for plants, okay, in order to produce their own foods. These are autotrophic producers, right? And so the chemical reaction requires carbon dioxide and water, right, in the presence of sunlight energy, and it produces glucose and oxygen, right? This is a chemical equation or equation and reaction that you should be familiar with, right? But I use this one because I felt like most people would readily identify with this chemical reaction. So those chemical bonds here, all right, when atoms of different elements interact together, there are forces of attraction that are responsible for this sort of bondage taking place, all right, and we can identify these forces of attraction as either strong or weak, all right. So some types of chemical bonds are covalent bonds and ionic bonds. You've probably heard about them before. These are the two major types of strong chemical bonds. Okay, not all interactions are going to be strong though, so there are also weak bonds that we'll take a look at that we see like in our water molecule with hydrogen. But here we have covalent bonds and ionic bonds. All right, write this down. Covalent bonds are formed during the sharing of electrons between atoms that result in a filled valence shell. This is a lot of information, but just kind of try to picture with me a compound. Here we have carbon dioxide. I think I used salt just a minute ago. Sodium chloride. So covalent bonds are when you have the sharing of electrons that are going to result in the a filled valence shell, and it's basically going to result in a new molecule being made. In this case, we have interactions between carbon and oxygen in this fixed ratio, and we have a carbon dioxide molecule being formed. Ionic bonds are formed between positive charges of a cation and the negative charge of an anion, and we end up making an ion, which is a element with a charged particle. Okay. An atom becomes an ion if it gains or loses electrons. Again, that's a lot of information for this course, but you should be familiar with this idea that when atoms of different elements interact together and those electrons out in those outer energy shells can be gained, lost, or shared, okay, depending on what's happening. If this atom gains or loses an electron, it becomes an ion, okay? All right. An example of a weak bond is hydrogen. All right, remember I just mentioned that these forces of attraction can be either strong, which we have our covalent and ionic bonds, but they can also be weak forces of attraction. All right, weak forces of attraction are, an example are hydrogen bonds. Okay, these are bonds that can be easily formed or easily broken, but when you have a lot of them together, they are considered to be very strong bonds when present in large numbers. So the hydrogen bond, just make a note of it, is an example of a weak attraction. So we see hydrogen bonding in the water molecule, right? I mentioned this earlier. The water molecule is one of the most abundant substances in our bodies, and they are formed with the hydrogen and oxygen elements in this fixed ratio. So we have covalent bonds here represented by this solid line, but these hydrogen bonds are indicated by the broken line. So hydrogen bonds form between um, separate water molecules here. So we have one water molecule here where we have two hydrogens and one oxygen. This is one water molecule. This is another water molecule, right? And hydrogen bonds are there. The last point I want to talk about tonight are some properties of water, right? And these properties are said to be life-supporting properties of water. We know that water is essential for life, right? Life's chemistry is tied to water, all right? Life first evolved in water, at least this is what we hold to be true. We know that all living organisms require water. Most of our cells are made up of about 70% water, so it is in fact true that most of life is connected to water, right? And those chemical elements, hydrogen and oxygen, are essential, right? So there are three properties of water that we want to be familiar with here. Probably heard about them before: cohesion, adhesion, and capillary action. Okay. Cohesion is a property of water that tells us that water molecules have a tendency to stick to one another. All right. Adhesion tells us that water molecules have the ability to stick to other types of substances. Right. So, for example, cohesion, water molecules stick together. If you've ever these water molecules stick together and creates kind of this surface tension. If you've ever seen like a bug walk across water, right? That's because surface tension is created with these molecules, these water molecules sticking together, right? Adhesion, and an example of adhesion would be if you've ever had a cold bottle of water and you've seen condensation on the outside of that bottle, right? That starts to condensation starts to form as the temperature is changing between the inside of that bottle and the external environment. And you start to see this water sort of adhering to the outside of that bottle. That's an example of adhesion. Capillary action is when water is moving through like a narrow tube, kind of like think of a straw or a vein or something like that. You might see this in plants, right? As water is sort of traversing up from the roots of plants or the stem of the plant out into, say, the petals on a plant. That's an example of capillary action. And capillary action is possible through the interaction of both cohesion and adhesion. That is going to allow for water to sort of traverse up that stem of that plant. Yeah, so cohesion. So again, these hydrogen bonds are here to make water sort of this liquid adhesive or cohesive substance. So again, we define cohesion as the tendency of these water molecules to stick together, whereas adhesion, we have water molecules sticking to other surfaces or substances. Again, that surface tension that I mentioned that's being created, like if you were in a pool and you see like a bug walking across, and that surface tension is created because these water molecules are interacting together, and it's becoming a very hard force to break, if you will. All right, this is just a visual here. This visual here shows us what's happening with water molecules during cohesion. These blue dots represent this sort of meniscus that's being formed. If this is a beaker or a cylinder, whatever you want to think about it as, water molecules are sticking together and forming this sort of caved surface here of the meniscus, and this is due to cohesive properties of water, right? And then if you look here, these red arrows indicates adhesive properties, adhesion, where water is sticking to other substances. So this water molecule is sort of starting to adhere to the sides of this beaker or cylinder, and this is representative of adhesion. Over here we have a illustration of what happens during capillary action, where you put this capillary tube down into some water. Eventually that water can start to traverse up that tube, and that's again due to interactions or forces between cohesion and adhesion that's going to lead to the movement of the water through those tubes. Some other properties of water, we know that water can exist in different states of matter, right, as a solid, liquid, or a gas. As it becomes more solid, it's going to become less dense, and that's why ice will float in water, okay? We talked about water, well, I mentioned it earlier that we sometimes refer to water as the universal solvent, okay? A solvent is a substance that can dissolve other substances, right? Water is very versatile as a solvent, right? It's one of the most commonly used solvents, right? And solutions are made as a result of mixing, you know, two or more substances where water could potentially be the solvent. These terms I do want you to be familiar with here that are in bold. A solution, okay? A solution by definition is a liquid consisting of a uniform mixture of two or more substances. Okay, so we create this solution. Okay, we're mixing these substances together in sort of a uniform way where it becomes homogeneous. You can't separate or see the two components anymore because they're dissolved. All right, the water, if you will, in this case would be the solvent, okay, that's going to dissolve our substances as we're making a solution. And then solutes, in this case, are the substances that's being dissolved, okay. Water molecule interactions, they can interact with substances in different ways, okay. Substances can be considered or interactions can be considered hydrophobic or hydrophilic depending on how it interacts with water. If it readily interacts with water and dissolves easily, where again there's no indication that there are other solutes in that mixture, we'll consider that to be a hydrophilic interaction, okay. Water loving, hydrophilic means water loving. So examples of, a hydrophilic interaction would be dissolving table sugar or salt in water, right? If you mix that mixture enough, it's going to become a homogeneous mixture and you can no longer see the solutes present. Or we can have a hydrophobic interaction where this substance is insoluble in water. So hydrophobic means water fearing. Examples of substances that will essentially be insoluble in water includes oils, fats, cholesterol, right? You've probably all done the experiments where you mix oil and water and you start to see some separation and some layers being created because that's not going to be a hydrophilic interaction. All right, I'm going to stop right here because I don't want to overload you and